Welcome, everyone. We are excited to see everyone at our BigTent Spotlight Speaker Series. For those of you who have not attended before, BigTentUSA is a national grassroots advocacy organization that promotes a pro-democracy platform focusing on the rights of all Americans, civic engagement, and good governance at the local, state, and federal level. Founded by a group of women in 2019, BigTent breaks through the political noise and provides a firm basis in reality, concrete action items, and innovative activism opportunities for our community to make a positive difference throughout the United States and beyond. We are an inclusive coalition of women and men who value preserving our democracy, defending women's rights, and protecting our children. I am thrilled to welcome Stephen Levitsky, Daniel Ziblatt, authors of the bestseller How Democracies Die and the new book Tyranny of the Minority. I'm especially grateful to welcome back under our virtual tent Ian Bassin, co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy, an organization that is the defender of American system of government against the threat of authoritarianism. A quick intro of Ian. He previously served as the Associate White House Counsel under President Obama, where his responsibilities included ensuring that the White House complied with the laws, rules, and norms that protect the democratic nature of our government. His writing on democracy, authoritarianism, the American law, and politics has appeared in prominent publications. He is recipient of the 2023 MacArthur Fellowship, the Skoll Award for Social Innovation, and has repeatedly been named among the 50 most influential people in Washington by Washingtonian magazine. Ian will introduce our esteemed authors and will moderate their conversation. Again, welcome Ian, Daniel, and Stephen. Ian, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. And I want to start with a huge thank you of appreciation and gratitude for everybody here tonight who's taking part in this. We are obviously living through a crisis for our democracy here in the United States and a crisis for democracy globally. We're going to talk tonight about some of the historical analogs and prologues to this, many of which are quite frightening in terms of what some of the things we're seeing might suggest about the future road we're on. But what gives me hope, what gives me confidence that we ultimately, notwithstanding some of the disturbing things that I think we probably will talk about tonight, that we will emerge from this stronger, is that we are doing the thing that you're supposed to do to protect democracy, which is participating in it. And nothing is a better example of that than all of you being here for this. People ask me all the time, what can I do to protect democracy? The answer is this: it is participate. Democracy is about citizens coming together to talk about self-government, public policy, the issues of the day in groups, how they can stay educated, informed, engaged, and be active citizens. And you're all doing that. So you give me great hope and inspiration. And I want to start there because I think there will be some darker moments and then we'll try to end on a lighter one. But I want to introduce our guests tonight, my fellow panelists, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. Just say a brief word about them and how the three of us came together. So Stephen is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and a professor of government at Harvard University. He's also the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard, and his research focuses on democratization, authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions. Daniel Ziblatt is Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard University and director of the Transformations of Democracy Group at Berlin's Social Science Center. He is also a scholar of European politics and specializes in the comparative study of democracy. Together and separately, Daniel and Stephen have authored numerous books, including, as Susan just mentioned, the new Tyranny of the Minority and the preceding How Democracies Die. How I came to meet Daniel and Stephen is coming out of the White House after I left the White House after the 2016 election. Several of my colleagues from the White House counsel's office, the Department of Justice, were concerned about whether all of the rules that we had enforced when we were in government would be upheld by an incoming administration that had shown tendencies towards illiberalism and authoritarianism during the campaign. Concerned about whether we should be doing something about that threat, we reached out to the leading scholars and experts on the topic, including Daniel and Stephen. And they quickly became our advisors and helped us understand that what we were just waking up to a little bit late here in the United States in late 2016 was actually a global trend where democracies around the world had been facing challenges in the 21st century. Early in our conversations, as they helped us to understand that trend, remember, they reached out to me and said, we're thinking about writing a popular book about our research on democracy and authoritarianism. Most of the stuff we've written has been directed at more of an academic audience, but we feel like this is a moment where the US is hungry for and might do well with a more of a mass market book talking about our studies, to which my co-founders and I said, absolutely do that. And they did, and that book became How Democracies Die. Here's why I think that book may be one of the most important books that's been written in current events and public affairs in recent memory, because it has been reported that as Joe Biden was debating whether or not to enter the race in 2020 and run after he had previously decided that his political career was likely over, that it was reading Daniel and Stephen's book that was one of the decisive factors that pushed him into the race, which may be one of the reasons why The Economist magazine called it, quote, the most important book of the Trump era. And I think if it had that impact, even that might be an understatement. 3 years into the Trump era, our organization, Protect Democracy, that Daniel and Stephen helped inspire, hosted a symposium on how do we get out of this crisis moment that we're in. Daniel and Stephen submitted an essay that we cross-published with The Atlantic that contained the seeds of what would become their most recent book, Tyranny of the Minority. And so I want to start, Stephen, if I can start with you, just getting us all up on sort of the same level playing field. For those who have not yet read the book, and I would encourage everyone to read both Tyranny of the Minority and How Democracies Die, give us a little bit of a summary of what Tyranny of the Minority is about and bring us all up to speed with a bit of a summary of the book.
Tyranny of the Minority has two main questions. The first question is, so the overall question is why American democracy, which really by all social science theory should be safe, should be stable. Rich democracies almost never die. Old democracies never die. Even if you date the birth of US democracy as recently as 1965, when we achieved full suffrage, U.S. democracy is more than 50 years old. It was more than 50 years old when Donald Trump got elected. No democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. So we should be safe. And yet we, all of us, have had an increasingly clear sense that something is wrong, that we're going off the rails. So the first part of the book asks the question of why the Republican Party turned against democracy. You cannot sustain a democracy with a two-party system in which one of the two parties is not fully committed to democracy. So we show, first of all, how the Republicans have turned away from democracy. We have a really simple set of criteria. A party that's committed to democracy needs to always unambiguously accept the results of elections, needs to always unambiguously reject the use of political violence, and needs to always unambiguously break with anti-democratic extremists in their own ranks. And we show how the Republican Party, which used to be a pro-democratic party, has abandoned those really simple principles in recent years. And then we ask the question of why that's happened. The second half of the book argues that we would actually be okay, despite the Republicans' authoritarian turn, if our democracy were like other democracies in which popular majorities actually rule. Because as you all know, MAGA, Trumpism have never represented a majority of Americans. Not for one day have they represented a majority of Americans. In fact, we argue in the book that for the first time in the 21st century, a consistent, stable, solid majority of Americans adheres to the basic principles of what we call multiracial democracy. They accept norms, or they support the idea of living in a diverse society, and they strongly support norms of racial equality, which are the basic pillars of multiracial democracy. Believe it or not, you could never find consistent majorities of Americans who supported that prior to the 21st century, but today that majority is there. The problem is that majority is hurling itself against the world's most counter-majoritarian institutions that allow partisan minorities to consistently thwart and sometimes even govern over majorities. And the book asks why those institutions came about in the United States, and shows that the United States wasn't the only country in the world that had these really excessively counter-majoritarian institutions. but that other democracies across the world have over time gradually dismantled or weakened those counter-majoritarian institutions and essentially become more democratic. And the United States, for various reasons that we discussed, has not. It's gotten stuck in what are essentially institutions from a pre-democratic era. And that threatens, for reasons that we lay out in chapter 6, to throw us into minority rule, in which a partisan minority is able to win power without actually winning electoral majorities. And that, of course, is not very democratic. Just to wrap up, in the final chapter, we lay out 15 reforms that we believe would, by empowering electoral majorities and allowing them to win elections and to govern, would make our system more democratic and help us in various ways move away from this period of constant crisis or this feeling of constantly being on the brink of political crisis where we've been the last 6-7 years.
And I want to come back to some of those recommendations and reforms at the end, but Daniel, I want to start with kind of the beginnings of this, the motivations of doing the second book, because if you read How Democracies Die, and I spoke to you both in 2016 and 2017, you were already pretty alarmed. That's why you wrote that book. And yet, in both the Atlantic piece that sort of preceded the new book and in your introduction to the new book, you talk about, notwithstanding the level of alarm that you had when you wrote How Democracies Die, you were still surprised by just how bad things seemed to go. And that sort of seems like that was part of the reasoning behind doing the second book. What were the things that surprised you and that motivated you to say, hey, we gotta come back at this and write a bit more on this topic?
Yeah, so I guess I would say two main points. One, our first book, How Democracies Die, laid out, it was a kind of warning about how democracies get into trouble, but really didn't provide an answer to what to do about it. And we often got questions, what do we do about it? And we realized in order to answer that question, we had to do a kind of deeper diagnosis of not, what could go wrong, but why things seem to be going wrong. And so we did a kind of deeper dive, a deeper diagnosis into that. And as we did that, and as events unfolded around us, we became increasingly worried. In particular, I think pretty clearly the events of January 6th, 2021 were a real turning point for most Americans, I think, where this really hit home, this effort to thwart a peaceful transfer of power was just a, overt kind of thing that we just would have never expected, that most Americans never expected. We had in our first book, we had one of the things that had motivated that book was back in the campaign of 2015, 2016, Donald Trump saying, he may not accept the results of elections if he lost. Well, we didn't really expect for somebody to, in fact, reject the results of elections, and that's what we saw on January 6th. So that was a big thing, that the actions of the Trump administration in that key moment. But I think the thing that really got us, focused on this was the degree to which the Republican Party and political elites surrounding Trump more generally, although they, very quickly condemned this, then quickly within several months stood by and essentially treated this event as if it were a non-event, or in fact treated the people who attacked the Congress as heroes, or essentially tried to rewrite the history and to say that this wasn't really a threat to democracy. And what really made us worried was, when we had studied democracies in other parts of the world at other points in time, there's always authoritarians. There's people who attack parliament buildings. There's people who carry guns and who are threats to democracy. But when democracies really get into trouble is when mainstream politicians around them, rather than condemning this, saying this is outrageous, having nothing to do with this, when mainstream politicians play along with these kinds of figures, that's when democracy gets into trouble. So 1920s, 1930s Europe, it was mainstream politicians who put the final nail in the coffin, essentially, of democracy. And in the 21st century as well, in many instances, it's mainstream politicians who stand by, who acquiesce in the face of threats to democracy. That's when democracy gets into trouble. And we began to see lots of that in the United States over the last 2 years. And so that makes us very worried. So that I think was the thing that really heightened the alarm for us and prompted us to write this book.
Daniel, let me stay with you for a second, because on that point of the 1920s, 1930s Europe, one thing that you guys wrote in How Democracies Die has stuck with me ever since, and I've repeated it as many times as I can, which is a comparison you make between how mainstream parties in Belgium and Finland reacted to extremists versus how mainstream parties in some other countries reacted and sort of the difference in outcomes. Can you say a little bit about what happened in Belgium and Finland and how that compared to places like Italy and Germany?
Yeah, so as I said, democracies tend to get into trouble. I mean, this happens. You have, people in the streets that are armed to threaten democracy, and the key question is how do mainstream elites respond to that? And what happened in Belgium and Finland in the 1930s, like in Germany and Italy and France, there was kind of fascist parties who identified with Hitler on the rise, who were gaining lots of support. This is kind of where the energy was. And so the key question, as in Germany and Italy, in Belgium and Finland, similarly, the question was, how are the mainstream elites going to respond to this? There's great temptation when you are a politician who's an establishment politician who's been around for a long time to see this kind of energy on your extreme and to think, hubristically think, well, I can tap into this. I'm the experienced political hand. I can kind of manage this. I can use this energy to ride this to power. And so in Belgium and Finland, just as in other places, this was the case. In Belgium in particular, I'll use this as an example. You had a very conservative Catholic party that didn't like the socialists. These were the two main parties that were democratic parties playing the democratic game. And you had the rise of a fascist party, and that Catholic party, these conservative elites saw this fascist party and thought, well, maybe we could work together with these guys and sideline the socialists. What happened, though, at a key moment in Belgian history is the Belgian king called all of the main parties, that is the conservatives and the socialists, into a room and said, under no conditions can any of you form a coalition with the fascists. And the Catholics were sort of tempted to. They hated the socialists. You don't need a king to do this. You need people with political judgment and political courage. And in the case of Belgium, it just happened to be a kind of king who was a figurehead. He said, I really suggest that you guys not do this. And in fact, the Catholics refused to form a coalition with the fascists. They worked together with the socialists, although disagreeing about every policy issue, but with a shared commitment to democracy, kept the fascists out of power. And Belgium democracy survived. And eventually it did collapse when the Nazis invaded, but democracy remained, in fact, endured. And, again, the lesson here is that when mainstream parties are willing, at least in the short run, to overlook their substantial policy difference out of a shared commitment to democracy, that democracy survives. When they don't do that, that's when democracy gets into trouble.
So this is why in Chapter 8, the key institutional reform that we call for is the establishment of a monarchy.
No, that's the solution to protecting democracy.
No, that's a joke. Yeah, but can I just say, one other very kind of clear contrary case is, there was an assault on the French Parliament in 1934 by a group of veterans and militia groups as they were counting votes in the French Parliament. Mainstream politicians in that case, mainstream center-right politicians in that case, kind of were in on the deal, knew that this was happening, didn't hold these guys to account. And within 6 years, French democracy collapsed. And many of those people who attacked the Parliament building in the 1930s went on to serve in the Nazi-sympathizing Vichy government. And so if you don't hold the guys to account who attack your Congress or your Parliament building, they're going to come back another day. So I think that's, again, a kind of a key lesson to draw from that.
Unless we all become monarchists, let's remember that, of course, it was the king in Italy who was the one who actually decided to make the deal to ride Mussolini's energy to power, thinking we can sideline that buffoon once he gets there, only to find out that was not going to be so easy. So Stephen, I'll admit I have a little bit of whiplash on one point, which is that I will just say, as a lawyer who's done a lot of work on civil rights throughout my career, I've typically found myself in the position of defending minority rights that for most of American history have been under assault. And you saw people concerned about the fairness of democracy trying to protect minority rights. And now we find ourselves in a situation where it's actually, as you described, the majority will that is struggling to sort of see itself translate into political power and policy. And obviously, there's a role for majority will. There's a role for minority protection. How do we think about these two different sets of interests in a liberal democratic system? Help us make sense of that.
That is a great question and a really important one, Ian, and one that we spend a lot of time thinking about, because democracy, as you know very well, absolutely requires the protection of minority rights. Modern democracy is liberal democracy. It combines majority rule with protection of minority rights. Without minority rights, there can be no democracy. So there are some minority rights that must always be protected from majorities. and from the whims of temporary majorities. And there are two that we specify in the book. One, which is the set of rights that you've devoted part of your career to defending, is basic civil rights, the rights of all individuals to vote, to free expression, to freedom of assembly, to freedom of speech, and freedom from discrimination, freedom of conscience, etc. Those basic individual rights, many of which are enshrined in the Bill of Rights, must always be protected from the whims of even the largest majorities. That's why we have the Bill of Rights. That's why we must have an independent judiciary, probably with some constitutional review power. The second minority right that must be protected is the rights to compete on a level playing field. The majority should not be able to use either popular majorities or legislative majorities to change the rules of the game, the political rules of the game, in ways that disadvantage or weaken or even outlaw the opposition. That is the kind of majority tyranny that we saw in Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, that we saw in Orban's Hungary, that we began to see in Israel and Netanyahu. So it should never be the case that a simple majority is able to change the political rules of the game. So those are two minority rights: the right to fair competition and the right to basic civil liberties that must always be protected from majorities. The thing is that there are other areas, other realms that are not necessarily essential minority rights. And there are two areas where we believe the majority should prevail. And those two areas are elections, that the party that wins more votes should win public office. I cannot think of a theory of liberal democracy that points us in any other direction. And secondly, with regular legislation, those who win majorities, those who win elections, should have a power to govern. They should majorities in legislature should be able to pass legislation as long as it's consistent with basic individual rights. So whereas civil rights and the democratic rules of the game must be protected from majorities, elections and legislatures should in fact be governed by majority rule. And so the counter-majoritarian institutions that protect partisan minorities in the legislature or empower partisan minorities in elections are not necessarily essential for democracy. I would argue they're antithetical to democracy. And one of the things we point out in the book is, although the U.S. does have some essential counter-majoritarian institutions that we would not ever think about touching, the Bill of Rights and independent judiciary, there are other counter-majoritarian institutions that enter into this realm of elections and legislation, and which are really quite undemocratic. The Electoral College, several aspects of the U.S. Senate, Supreme Court with lifetime tenure security, and the extraordinary difficulty of changing the U.S. Constitution.
I'm going to stick with you, Stephen, and let me just note that I'm going to ask maybe one or two more questions, then I'm going to open it up in the chat. So if you have questions, please write them into the chat. I'll go through there and try to moderate and pick from there things I think will be good for keeping this lively. But you talk about some of the counter-majoritarian institutions that we have in this country, whether it be the Electoral College, I assume by sort of choke points on majorities being able to pass legislation. That's a reference perhaps to the filibuster or other ways in which it can be extremely difficult for a majority to actually enact the agenda on which it ran. Earlier you alluded to the fact that other advanced democracies may have had aspects of some of these counter-majoritarian institutions at various points in time, but have sort of, you've written about how they've kind of leapfrogged us. They've made reforms, and many of them are much more healthy democracies and more advanced democracies than we are. Can you give some examples of other countries that had some of these counter-majoritarian features, but then went and updated their systems, and compare that to what has happened here?
Sure, and Daniel might, who's our Europe expert, may be able to jump in with some examples as well. But we began back in the late 18th century with the really far and away the most progressive and democratic constitution in the world at the time, and well into the 19th century. Most European systems were still monarchies. They still had monarchic vetoes. They had unelected or really, really badly gerrymandered legislatures that were completely unrepresentative. They had limits on suffrage. They had filibuster-like mechanisms that allowed minorities to permanently stall out or block legislation. And so well into the 19th century, most of Europe was less democratic than the United States. In Latin America, Latin American republics in the early 19th century modeled themselves on the United States and wrote constitutions that were presidentialist and very similar to ours. Most of them elected either a system in which presidents were only indirectly elected by Congress or directly copying the United States adopted electoral colleges. And over the course of the 19th and 20th century, many of these institutions were either dropped or watered down. So a classic example, of course, is the House of Lords in Britain, which is an unelected body which had real veto power over critical legislation up until the early 20th century. Extraordinarily undemocratic. That was reformed, however, in the early 20th century. Several countries in Europe, including Sweden, had relatively undemocratic upper chambers, Senate-like bodies that they dissolved, that they eliminated over the course of the 20th century. They went from bicameral to a single chamber. Every democracy, every presidential democracy in Latin America, in fact, every other presidential democracy in the world got rid of its electoral college. The last country other than the United States to have an electoral college was Argentina. It got rid of it in 1994. Every other established democracy in the world established either term limits or a retirement age for Supreme Court and Constitutional Court justices, leaving the United States as the only established democracy in the world that still has lifetime tenure for its justices. So these are reforms that occurred gradually in fits and starts across other democracies that made us from a pioneer in the late 18th century, much of the 19th century, into a real democratic laggard by the early 21st century. And that there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is simply that among democracies, the U.S. Constitution is the most difficult to reform. We in the book we spend a few pages comparing the United States to Norway, which started off at the time of in the early 19th century as a monarchy, with much less democratic than the United States, but that has modified its constitution I think 300 plus times since the early 19th century, and have become dramatically surpassed the United States and become one of the most democratic societies and democratic regimes in the world. So the difficulty of changing the Constitution is one reason why we've fallen behind.
So we're behind. We got to catch up, and this gets to the reforms. And so I'm going to go to a couple of the questions here that really get at this. So Judith asked, besides voting, which I always do, what else can an individual citizen do that might help? Does writing to our representatives make a difference? The answer to that is yes. I've worked in government, absolutely does. Can changes to campaign finance rules or lobbying money help? Sort of teeing up a set of questions about what are the reforms that people should be pushing for. Allison also asked, what are the top 5 priorities? If you had to rank, what are the things that we could do that would catch us up to these countries that have leapfrogged us and get us back in the lead as the sort of beacon of democracy around the world? Give us some of those that people should be sort of calling their representatives, organizing, talking about, and asking for. I'll let you guys pick who wants to tackle.
So we in our book we have 15 proposals. You asked for 5. I mean, I think that the broader point here is that if we want to understand the crisis we're in, it's not just about the forces pushing against democracy. It's that our institutions make us vulnerable to this. And so we have, it's important to focus on the 2024 election, absolutely critical, and to think short term, but we have to kind of think short term and long term simultaneously. And so that, that means thinking about why reforming some of our institutions that will continue to leave us vulnerable unless we address them. And so some of the top line items in my mind, and Steve, may want to add to this. I think, for instance, the filibuster is something that does not require a weakening or eliminating the filibuster. Is something that does not require constitutional change, but it's something that would allow for the passage of voting rights. I mean, there's this bill H.R. 1, which is a voting rights bill, which was passed by the House of Representatives when it was under the control of the Democrats, and could have had a majority support in the U.S. Senate, but was blocked by filibuster because it requires the super majority requirements to get it through the Senate, and so this held this up. So if filibuster reform were introduced in the U.S. Senate, and it's just a Senate rule, something that could be changed, then it would allow for the passage of all sorts of other kinds of very popular legislation, gun control, and so on. But in addition to that, voting rights, and I think voting rights is another institutional reform that's critical. So that would be second on my list, which also does not require institutional changes. And this H.R. 1 bill, which I encourage you all to go look at if you don't already know it, includes things such as protecting voting rights, but also limits on gerrymandering, limits on campaign spending, and so all of in the role of money in elections. And so once we do those two things, I think it then generates momentum for further change. And I'll end with the third thing. So not a list of 5, although we do have a list of 15. A third thing that I think is really critical is term limits for Supreme Court justices. This is something that there's some dispute over whether or not this requires constitutional amendment or not. But along with Steve's list of what other democracies have done, every other established democracy in the world has implemented either retirement ages or term limits for the equivalents to our Supreme Court, to their national judiciaries. I think, in general, I don't think term limits are great for legislatures, but when it comes to courts, all democracies, face this dilemma of you want judges to be independent. So you don't want them, to be voted out or have short-term limits. They want them to be independent and have some discretion. But on the other hand, there's this problem that judges, selected by a majority or sometimes even a minority through the Senate, in a previous generation, continue to serve because of these lifetime appointments into the next generation. And the kind of sense that our justice system is out of sync with, in particular, the Supreme Court, with where the public is due to these long-term, lifetime terms of judges. And so I think this is something also that would be really critical to address. So those are just 3 things, but I think there's other really important things, but I'll maybe give Steve a chance to address some of those.
Well, first of all, let me just reiterate Daniel's first point, or second one, which is that there are a whole series of steps we can take to make it much easier for people to get access to the ballot and vote. And these should be no-brainers. The United States is an outlier in this way too. We're really one of the only established democracies. In fact, I think the only established democracy I know of where the government really doesn't lift a finger to make it easy to vote. In a democracy, people vote. People are supposed to vote. That's the defining feature of a democracy. And so in most countries, most democracies in the world, the government makes it easy for people to vote. In many democracies, it is mandatory to vote. It's considered a civic duty, and it's like paying your taxes. You have to vote. In most democracies, people automatically become registered to vote when they're 18. There's no extra obstacle course to go through to get registered. It's automatic. And in virtually every democracy in the world outside the United States, elections take place on a Sunday or a holiday, so people don't go through the great difficulties that many Americans do in sort of getting off work to vote. So these are really simple, no-brainer steps that would not resolve all the problems facing our democracy, but would, we will be a much healthier democracy if 75 to 80% of Americans were voting in elections, as opposed to, say, 55 to 60%. To add a fourth one, and this is a little harder, but it's really quite straightforward. We have to abolish the Electoral College. That's not something that's going to happen before 2024. It's not something that's going to happen immediately, but we have come very close to abolishing the Electoral College before. In 1969, 1970, both political parties supported it. Richard Nixon supported it. It passed the House of Representatives with an overwhelming majority, but was blocked, and had a majority in the Senate, but was blocked. So it's not like the abolition of the filibuster is some kind of pie in the sky fantasy. Again, it's going to take some work, but it's a really simple thing. It's a really important democratizing step. And I think in particular, I mean, God forbid, but if Donald Trump wins the presidency via the Electoral College again in 2024, you're going to see a whole generation of younger Americans who grew up in a world in which the loser of the popular vote won the presidency 3 times. And these folks, for good reason, are not going to believe that they're living under a democratic system that's going to really, really corrode the legitimacy of our system. And so we have to, even though we haven't talked about it much in recent years, we need to get back to discussing a very, very simple form, which is we should be directly electing the president, like in every other presidential democracy on earth.
I'm guessing that the attendees here are a bibliophile group, and so I'll put another plug in for a book on, if you want to read more about the Electoral College, its history, efforts to reform it, and the reasons why it should be reformed. There's a book called Let the People Pick the President by Jesse Wegman, who's a member of the New York Times editorial board. It is an excellent survey of everything you want to know about the history of the Electoral College and reasons for reforming it. One thing I learned from it was that there's been a lot of talk that I've certainly heard over the years that the Electoral College was some sort of brilliant compromise that the founders came up with in sort of one of their moments of inspiration. It's actually not the history of what happened. It was the one thing that they actually could, it was the last thing that they couldn't actually resolve during the summer of the Constitutional Convention. And they were so frustrated in the heat with drinking a lot of beer and wanted to get out of there, that in the final end, they just signed off on something that none of them really liked. And within months and years of it, most of the leading creators of it came back to recant and regret that they had enacted that. And it was not something that, several years later, really anyone who had been at the Constitutional Convention was fighting to preserve. I'm glad you guys mentioned sort of the right to vote, because I think most people don't realize that we don't actually have a fundamental right to vote in this country. We don't have a constitutional right to vote. And the statutes that have been passed, things like the Voting Rights Act, get at specific ways in which the US Code prohibits discriminatory practices in voting, but none of it creates a baseline fundamental right to vote. And in fact, in the bill that Daniel referenced, HR 1 from the last Congress, there is what would be the first ever baseline statutory right to vote embedded in that bill. And I'm proud to say that came out of conversations between one of my co-founders and a former intern at Protect Democracy and a former student of ours at the Harvard Clinic on Democracy and the Rule of Law, and eventually got introduced by Senator John Ossoff and Rep. Mondaire Jones. So we have some stuff out there that could start to solve some of these problems if we could get actual majorities to be able to pass legislation, as Daniel referenced. I want to pivot a little bit, though, from some of the domestic conversations. There are a couple questions in the chat. I'm trying to abstract out to more of a global level. So Lexi asked, speaking of the 1920s, 1930s Europe, how concerned are you about recent elections of far-right politicians in the Netherlands, Slovakia, Argentina, et cetera? Is this a harbinger of things to come? And there's also a question from Kitty about, can you talk about why support for Ukraine is so important in the battle for American democracy? So maybe, Daniel, I'll start with you, and then Stephen, if you want to jump in. Talk a little bit globally about what's happening to democracy and how what we're seeing in kind of all these other parts of the world we should be thinking about as people who care about democracy here in the United States.
I think it's an important question to understand that what's happening in the United States is not unique to the US, that there are these global trends, and that in many ways our society is very similar to lots of other societies, especially in Western Europe and in other parts of the world. And the real similarity is that there is this kind of 20 to 35% of most national electorates in old established democracies that find the kinds of messages appealing that radical right parties tend to offer. So whether that's the Wilders party in the Netherlands, the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, which is a kind of successor to a Nazi party in Sweden, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany in Germany. These are radical right parties that are anti-immigrant, that tend to be, play with violence in their rhetoric, and really threaten to undermine democracy, or tend to kind of regard themselves as outsiders to the political system, and very analogous to the MAGA movement, MAGA faction of the Republican Party. And that number is roughly about the same in the United States, is 30 or so percent. What's striking actually to me when I think about this is how similar this kind of demographic is. We tend to think of the US maybe as being different, very different from these other societies, but in many ways it's not. I mean, this number is pretty similar. This is a real regularity across advanced democracies. So what's different about the United States than a lot of these other societies is that in the United States, because of these institutions that Steve has just described, it's possible for this minority faction, again, usually not more than 30, 35% of the electorate, to take control of the kind of key levers of power. In Germany, for instance, the Alternative for Germany, although it's a frightening party, it has been kept to the sidelines because of the way that political system, multi-party political system works. That 30% faction is isolated; it's not in power. And even in places, and this is likely what may happen in the Netherlands as well, and even in those rare instances where this kind of faction has been able to gain access to a cabinet, let's say in Italy, or in access to government in majority power in Sweden, it's always part of a coalition. And so this kind of dilutes the power of this faction. In the United States, because we have this curious system, a two-party system, I mean, that's one of the, you'd asked Ian about other reforms. I mean, one of the things we could also talk about is kind of the case for a multi-party system. Because we have a two-party system, the hope was always that if this kind of a faction emerged, it would be kind of, suffocated within one of the two parties. But what we didn't count on was the prospect that 30% could take over one of the two parties. And when it does, and it wins an election, it can single-handedly hold control of the presidency. And if we really are unlucky in a kind of trifecta nightmare scenario of 2024, you could have that same 30% dominating, all three branches of government. So the similarities between our societies and other societies, and there's the same kind of resistance to kind of multiculturalism, to economic dislocation. That's a problem, but what's even more of a problem is our institutions that give those groups access to power. Just very quickly on the Ukraine thing, Steve maybe has something else to say on this. I mean, I think the reason why, one of the reasons the Ukraine kind of Russia war is so revealing is that that Russia has sort of somehow turned into a model for authoritarians around the world. And so, it's sort of a slogan to say this, but there's something really to it, that this is a kind of battle for democracy, and that if Russia wins in Ukraine, this is bad news for democracy in all of Europe. I mean, the authoritarians within Europe are the ones rooting for Putin. I mean, Viktor Orban, although they're part of NATO and Hungary, is kind of secretly sort of cheering on Putin and sort of trying to make kind of peace with Putin. And so I think what you see here really is the kind of, it's sort of, there's a lot of other factors at work, but what you really see here is an effort to kind of defend democracy against an authority. And you also see the dangers, I should add, of authoritarianism. And when a single political leader like Putin can write in a little manifesto that he did several years ago that Ukraine is part of Russia, unconstrained leader can from one moment to the next then carry out a war to implement his vision. I have a tough time getting my students to, read the readings on my course syllabus. To be an authoritarian, to control a political system and determine the foreign policy, a single leader being able to do this shows you the dangers of authoritarianism. And so we should take that also as a warning.
Stephen, did you want to jump in there?
Just to say that although it's, I agree with Daniel that there is this broad, roughly 25, 30-ish% of electors throughout Western Europe who are supporting far-right political forces and who are quite illiberal. The parties that represent them, in part for the reasons that Daniel elaborated, have not behaved in as openly authoritarian fashion as the Republicans, with the exception of some really fascist parties that have not come anywhere near power, like the Golden Dawn in Greece. Most of the far right in the Netherlands or in Scandinavia, I don't like these guys, and I disagree with them really strongly in a bunch of positions. And there are things to worry about with regard to them, and they are rooting for Putin, but none of them have rejected the results of elections. For the most part, they have not openly advocated or condoned violence the way that many Republicans have, and they have not, for the most part, embraced extremist paramilitaries or nominated as candidates people who have tried to overturn elections in their ranks. So even comparing the Republicans to the far right in Western Europe, the Republican Party still comes off as more authoritarian, and that should give us pause.
So some of the questions in the chat are getting at kind of what could be driving even the minority fraction to be perhaps slightly more empowered, virulent, broader today. And there's questions about whether the media landscape, social media is contributing to it. Henry has a question. Is the 30% of the population across nations being anti-democratic similar across history? If not, is it due to the internet allowing people to unite in those factions? Are there anything that you can point to in terms of whether our present sort of strain of anti-democratic populism that you're seeing in the US and other places, is it higher than it used to be? And if so, why? How do you put this current moment into that kind of historical context? And Stephen, maybe why don't you take that one?
Okay, I think Daniel will have some insights on change over time in Europe. But let me say about the United States, I'm speaking in pretty rough terms, but there's always been a pretty authoritarian element in the US electorate and a kind of a populist anti-system element in the US electorate. If you go back to support for Huey Long or Father Coughlin or George Wallace in the 1960s, it's not hard to find 20-something, even 30% support for extremist, sometimes fairly authoritarian figures. But there are a couple of differences. One, throughout history, the authoritarian elements, and particularly those who are most, let's call them to be benign, racially conservative, those who are most resistant to multiracial democracy, they have been diffused between the two parties. They've been, as recently as the 1970s, there were more of these folks in the Democratic Party than there were in the Republican Party. But for most of the 20th century, the Republicans had some really far-right sort of racist elements. The Democrats had a lot of far-right conservative racist elements in the South. And because that roughly 30% was divided between the two parties, they could be kept to the margins. They didn't dominate the national party. But then something changed with the Civil Rights Revolution. With the Civil Rights Revolution, the Democratic Party, which had been the party of Jim Crow for a century, gradually became the party of civil rights. And this was the New Deal era still. The Democrats were the dominant party. The Republicans had been the minority party in the United States since the 30s. And the Republican politicians looked out and they saw whites in the South who had been for generations Democrats, overwhelmingly Democrats, very discontented with civil rights and policies, government policies aimed at implementing racial equality, busing, affirmative action, fair housing policies. And they realized that there was a constituency to be tapped. So the Republican Party, trying to win, to expand, doing what parties do, trying to expand its electorate, spent 20 years between Goldwater and Reagan in particular, systematically going after racially conservative whites, especially, not exclusively, but especially in the South. And they were very successful. And so they basically shepherded over the course of 30, 40 years, shepherded the white racial conservatives from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. So in the 21st century, the more authoritarian elements, and especially the more anti-multiracial democracy elements of our electorate, which have always been there, are now overwhelmingly in the Republican Party. And that became, in effect, a primary winning group within the Republican Party. That's what allowed the 30% to capture a single party, as Daniel referenced earlier. So it's really only in the 21st century that the Republican Party is dominated by these racially conservative voters.
Daniel, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah,
Historical trends.
I would just say, thinking of other countries, why is this happening everywhere? I'm hearing myself echo. It's not just about, the US, these dynamics have played out because of race and the legacy of slavery. In other West European societies are also becoming incredibly diverse due to immigration. You combine this with, the legacies of colonialism in effect, in part, that's part of the story. But as these societies have become the destinations of diversity, and you walk around the streets of Zurich or Amsterdam or anywhere in Europe, these cities are as diverse as American cities. You combine this with some of the economic pressures that are also racking American society, And together, these two forces provide, incredibly powerful raw materials for demagogues who, when people feel dissatisfied and disaffected from their politics and dissatisfied with their standard of living, it's very easy to target others. And so I think that dynamic is playing out in Western Europe as well as the United States. And it seems to be taking this particular virulent form, I would say, in the United States, partly because American society is not only more diverse, but the kind of multiracial democracy in some sense has progressed furthest. And so the pushback against it is strongest. But also it brings it back to our institutions. Our institutions are having this kind of nasty feedback effect on our politics. And insofar as the Republican Party can win majorities, even when, or that is, win power without winning majorities, can win the presidency without winning majorities. And so the kind of temptation to play with extremist politics is there. And if both parties had to win over 50% of voters to win power, then the Republican Party in particular wouldn't be able to play with these kinds of very dangerous kind of politics that they play with, and they would have to avoid the kind of extremism. They would be punished at the ballot box. But because they don't need to win actual outright majorities to win power, they can play with this kind of politics in a way, and play in this kind of radical extremist politics in a way that mainstream parties that want to win majorities and want to build majority coalitions in Western Europe are not able to do. So I think this way our institutions are actually making our situation this transition to multiracial democracy even more difficult.
As we get near to the end of the hour, I want to pivot us to sort of being proactive. And there's a bunch of questions in the chat that are sort of the pleas for, okay, so what do we do? And not only what do we do, but, there are some questions in the chat that are, is it hopeless almost? You talk about how difficult it is to amend the Constitution, how with such counter-majoritarian forces, how could you even overcome those to enact reform? So I'd love to ask both of you to reflect a little bit on, either or both of what are the specific things that you think can be done and that people can do? And are there examples or models out there that give you hope about why, even faced with some pretty daunting sort of hills in front of us, you think these are surmountable? And I'm going to include, maybe to start off, Beth's question. I mean, are you guys talking to national policymakers about these problems and possible solutions? So maybe, Steve, why don't I let you start on that one? Sort of all of those, what can be done? What's the inspiration? Are you guys doing stuff about this? What can others do? And then Danielle, I'll come back to you.
Okay. Well, let me try to answer a couple of those. First of all, let me make a plug for Protect Democracy. We do try as much as we can to work with Protect Democracy and other organizations, and to get access to the public debate and to politicians to make the case for democratic reforms. And we are so happy that organizations like Protect Democracy exist, and we take advantage of their existence as much as we can to get to speak to politicians. Let me just point to two areas of that might maybe help us sleep a little better tonight. A couple areas, reasons for, I don't know about optimism, but at least for hope. And then we can talk about what we can do. First of all, it's important to remember that we have all kind of grown up in an era, in a very strange and kind of unique era in U.S. history, in which the democratic rules, the democratic system is kind of frozen. And that hasn't always been the case. The founders didn't think the democratic system should be frozen. George Washington wrote a letter to his nephew just weeks or a couple months after the writing of the Constitution, describing the new Constitution as an imperfect document and stating that it was going to be up to future generations to improve upon it. And that's exactly what future generations did, beginning with the Bill of Rights, to the gradual expansion of suffrage, to the very important Reconstruction reforms, to the very important progressive era reforms, to the civil rights reforms, which were not constitutional, but were legal. Throughout history, Americans, sometimes from below, sometimes from above, have worked to make our system more democratic. And it's really only in the last 50-ish years that we've just stopped doing that. We've stopped thinking about making our system more democratic. So it's not some kind of radical adventure we need to go on to think about reforming our system. It's a great, long-established American tradition. The other reason for optimism is that young people are much more comfortable with and supportive of the principles of multiracial democracy than are old folks like us. And we're part of the book is about how this transition to multiracial democracy has generated a powerful conservative and even authoritarian reaction. And we're in the middle of that very, very difficult transition. There's never been a democracy in which a dominant ethnic group lost its societal dominance and its electoral majority. We are the first to make that transition. We're in the middle of that transition, and it's rough. But the reason why I think we'll make it through is that the key principles of multiracial democracy, accepting diversity and supporting and a commitment to racial equality, those values are strongest among the millennials and Gen Z. And so I think those generations, if we empower them, if we get them to vote, if we give them political power, if we empower majorities, they're going to reconsolidate our multiracial democracy.
Daniel, 2 minutes.
Yeah, can I give you the last word, Ian? I would like to hear what you have to say about what can be done. I mean, you're the activist. I mean, we've laid out a series of institutional reforms, but 2024 is only a few months away, right? So what is it that people listening in here can do?
Yeah, so I mean, look, there's everything from the creative ideas out there. Donna mentioned something in the chat about can the Constitution's representative guarantee clause, which is a clause in the Constitution that guarantees a representative form of government, be animated to protect a more democratic system. In fact, our organization has looked very deeply at that. And I think that those are the kind of things that in the future, I think we will look back on and see that they have been activated. Because if you look back at the history of the country, constitutional provisions that were not active at one point in time became more active at another, or that meant something at one point in time, separate but equal, eventually came to mean something else, which is equal means equal. And that's been the history of the country. And at every time where it feels like you can't make progress, there's a breakthrough. And I've learned something in my political career, which is, and I'm a Yankees fan, so I'll quote Yogi Berra on this, which is it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. If you had asked the average American in 2003, in the heat of the Iraq War after 9/11, if the next American president's name would be Barack Hussein Obama, nobody would have believed that would be possible. And then similarly, if you had asked Americans in 2011, if the next American president was going to be Donald John Trump, most people would have said that's absolutely impossible. So to the extent that we think there are things that we've talked about today that are absolutely impossible, I give you the names of the last two presidents before the current one as things that were impossible mere years before it happened. How did those things happen? When Barack Obama was elected, people got engaged and optimistic about our country. And one of the things that I felt as a part of that campaign was something that I think Gloria references in the chat, which is a sense of common purpose and common humanity. So we started this, Susan talked about, yes, we got to vote. Absolutely, we got to vote. Everyone here has got to be organized and got to be voting. But the other thing we got to do is we got to model what it means to be fellow Americans again. I know in a moment like this, when there's a lot of fear about the future, we can slip into hostility and nervousness that our neighbor might be a threat to us. But that sort of division, that sort of hostility, that's what authoritarianism thrives on. What democracy thrives on is a sense of common purpose, that we're all in a shared endeavor. And for people on this call, we are the leaders in our communities, the civic leaders who can model that. So I would leave us with this. We must participate. We must vote. We must hold conversations like this. And everybody on this call needs to be a leader in your community, trying to turn people away from the anxiety, the fear, the hopelessness on which authoritarianism thrives, and orient people towards the idea that anything is possible, and the reforms that Daniel and Stephen write about in the book can be the democracy we hand off to our children. And the first step is actually believing that to be possible. And my experience is anything is, especially in the history of this country. So I want to leave us with that thought. Thank Daniel, thank Stephen, thank Susan and the BigTent team. Wish everybody a very happy and healthy holiday and new year, and may 2024 bring more democracy to the United States and to the world. Thank you all very, very much.